Hey there everybody, it's Mike DiLisio with another solo mode review. Today I'm going to be taking a look at the solo mode for Cellulose, a plant cell biology game from designers John Corveyu and Steve Schlephorst and publisher Genius Games. Cellulose is a worker placement, resource gathering game where you are building up a plant cell. I think. Look, I'm not a biology major and never claimed to be. I might know a little bit more about plant cell biology than I did before I played the game, but that's still not a whole lot. Let's head over to the table. I'll talk to you really primarily about the solo mode, the components that are specific to it. Then we'll come back here and I'll give you my final thoughts. Okay, here we see the solo setup for a game of Cellulose, a plant cell biology game. And a couple of things that I'm going to point out right off the bat is that this is simulating a two-player game. So you're going to play it on the 1 to 3 player side of the board. This is a double-sided board that has some differences as far as the action spaces go, depending upon player count. But the only real difference as far as setup for a solo game is going to focus on the solo components. And so let me kind of show off the aspects of the game that are specific to solo. So you've got this action board here. Actually, it's really called a strategy and plant growth mat. I believe that's the correct terminology. And you have two different options. You can have it on the easy side, or you can have it on the medium or hard side, which is going to give some bonuses depending upon which strategies they gain throughout the game. But I'm just going to focus on the easy side because, let's face it, I'm not terribly good at games. And so I'll just place that there. The other components that are specific to the solo game are some solo action cards. And what you do at the beginning of the game is you separate them into 3 kind of stacks. You've got this single line stack that corresponds to the cell wall that's going to be built throughout the game. You'll take those cards, you'll shuffle them up, and these are the action cards that Ivy, your automated opponent, is going to start with. You also have some level 2 cards that you can shuffle up. They're not going to come into play until the cell wall has been built up to that line. So the first 4 carbohydrates get placed down. That's going to now put these cards into Ivy's discard pile that will eventually get put into her deck or hand eventually. And then you've got these strategy cards. Generally speaking, 2 of these are going to be added to Ivy's deck throughout the game, and that's going to be based upon whichever strategy that she is going to take throughout the game. And so at the beginning, you place 1 of her action markers into the central area. Actually, I don't know if they're called action markers, but we'll just call them discs. You place 1 into the center of that 5x5 grid, and then 1 at the bottom of her plant growth track. Okay, so Ivy is not going to be on the main growth track, as in a 2-player game or a 3-player, whatever. She's going to have her growth marker over there. All right, so I'm not going to go into a comprehensive rules overview on how Cellulose the game works. I'm going to kind of save that for the multiplayer review, which I'm sure is going to go into more detail. But I'll give you a general overview in case you have no context at all. This is a worker placement game, and you're going to be placing your action markers out onto the board to take different actions. Of course, in the ultimate goal of gaining points. That's what you're trying to do. And you're going to do that through a number of ways. You're going to be gathering resources like water and CO2. You're going to be converting water and CO2 into carbohydrates. You're going to also be gaining hormones and proteins. You're going to be growing to gain income. You're going to be potentially grabbing the first player marker here. You're also going to be gathering cards that you can play in front of you into a tableau that are going to give you points. They're going to give you abilities, sometimes one-time actions, sometimes things that can be triggered based upon other cards that you are playing. So, you know, I'm first player in a solo game. The human opponent takes the first player, and let's just say that I went ahead and I placed onto this spot here. This would mean that I'd gather the amount of water that is marked at the beginning of the game, which is 5. I'd take my 5 water, and then I would have the option of putting anywhere from 0 to 3 water into my little central vacuole, which is a little bit of like an area majority to earn points at the end of the round. So let's say I pop 2 in there if I'm playing purple. Okay, that's my little area. The Ivy's area would be over here because I just chose yellow arbitrarily for her. Now, what Ivy's going to do is they're going to draw the top card of their action deck, and you're going to evaluate the card from top to bottom. All right? And so what this says here is if they had the resources to do the 2 times carbohydrates, they would do that. They would need to have 12 water and 12 CO2, but clearly this is the first turn of the game. They do not have that option. So then you would go down and you would say, do they have less than 4 cards in hand? If so, get a specialization card. All right, well, they have no cards in hand. You would kind of keep their hand down here at the bottom. So that's what they're going to do. They're going to place their action marker onto the corresponding spot down here. This is kind of the card market. There's only one specialization card, so this is the card that they're going to take. They're going to take this enzyme production card. Okay, now, this card is related to a particular strategy, and so for this case, with this being the enzyme production card, they're going to move their marker down. They're moving towards the enzyme strategy, and this is going to go onto the leftmost spot underneath their board, because when they play cards, if they have options among the same type of card, they're going to play oldest to newest, and when they play the card, it's going to go up here. If it is a specialization card, it's going to go somewhere over here if it's an enzyme card, because those can trigger off of each other and combo. All right? This doesn't get refilled. Back and forth we go. I place my action markers. Ivy's going to place their action markers based upon the different cards they have. Now, also looking at this card, I kind of want to show you a couple of things. As I said, you would evaluate it all the way down. This particular action allows them, if they have 2 action markers left, they place 2. In this case, they would cover up the most valuable of the hormone spot to block it from me, and then they would place their other one, in this case, onto this spot, which is right here, and they would move their marker up. All right? This case, they would draw a card from the top of the deck. They would take it, and in this case, this is a enzyme card. So they'd place this here, and now they've moved down into the enzyme strategy area of their board, meaning that they're never going to move up. They've already hit one of their strategies. So in that case, what I would do is I would find the corresponding strategy card, which is this one, and this card is going to allow them to trigger those enzyme card abilities at later points, and I put that into their discard. So this is how the strategies work. They kind of build towards a particular strategy, again, either growth or getting blue cards or enzyme cards or the central vacuole strategy, and eventually they're going to probably move into a corner. So maybe in this case, let's say I hadn't put those there, they win the central vacuole at the end of the round, they would start moving this way. They would start moving here. Maybe they eventually get into this strategy, a combination of enzymes and central vacuoles. I would then place that strategy card into their hand, into their discard pile, so that later on in the game, they're going to continue to work towards this strategy to make them more competitive in a couple of particular realms, because oftentimes as a player, you're going to specialize on 1 or 2 things. Ivy also is going to specialize on 1 or 2 things. Once the cell walls are going to get built throughout the game, which is also the timer towards the end of the game, as soon as it gets over here, that triggers the end game. Once the first 4 carbohydrates are placed and you get to that part, now you're going to take the second kind of stage powers and you're going to place them into Ivy's discard, and that's going to add new, more powerful actions that they're going to take. So in the case of these, if they get at least 8 points, because these are fluctuating points along here, if they would get at least 8 points, they would build a carbohydrate, if they had it, into the cell wall, and they would place one of the water from the supply into the central vacuole. 2 times the photosynthesis spot, cover up the ribosome spot, the most valuable one for me, gain 2 points. If they have this strategy, gain a blue card. If not, go to that spot. So you can see how these cards kind of trigger based upon what other cards that they've had. Also, during the first portion of the game, these first four, at least the first four, I should say at most the first 4 rounds, they're going to only be gaining cards into their tableau. They won't be playing the cards. After the game has reached that second kind of stage, now they're going to potentially be playing cards. And so that's what these mean down here. They mean if you're in the second stage, then play a blue card from the hand. If you're in the second stage, play a green card from the hand. These types of things, okay? So at the beginning of the game, they are gathering up cards. They're going to get them throughout the whole game, but they're really more focusing on gathering cards, getting a hand in play, and then actually playing them into their player areas depending on which type of card throughout the game. They also can gain an extra action marker just as the player can by winning the central vacuole majority at the end of the round. So let's just to explain that, let's say that Ivy at the end of the first round had not placed any water into the supply. Since I have the most, I would move my marker up 1, I would gain a point. These would come back out of there into the supply, and I would gain this first player marker. So that's how you get the extra marker, is every round, if there is a winner here, then that player gets it. If they're tied, we would both move up and get the points, but no one would get this gray action marker. So you want to always at least be tied or ahead in the central vacuole area to keep Ivy from getting that extra action marker, because those cards obviously are going to be Ivy's way of gaining points. You continue to play throughout the game, moving along this cell wall, either by placing action markers here, by converting the water and the CO2 that you've gained throughout the game by placing them there and getting the associated points, or at the end of the round, automatically 1 carbohydrate is going to be placed onto that wall. You're also going to be building up your income by moving along this growth track. So let's say I had moved myself down here by paying associated costs and taking the associated actions, and maybe I'd moved here and then moved here. During the beginning of every round, during what they call the sunrise phase, I'm going to get these associated incomes. I'd get 1 protein here, I'd get 3 water, I'd get 6 CO2, and the ability one time to convert into photosynthesis into a carbohydrate. So all of these are going to be kind of the structures of the round, and that's laid out right here. Get your income, take your turns, prepare for the next round, figure out who's the leader in the central vacuole, reset the water, burn cards, put new cards out. All right. That's the general overview of the game. Ivy's going to be playing out cards, gaining their strategies, moving up their plant track, and fighting with you tooth and nail to be the most successful in Cellulose, a plant cell biology game. Let's head back over and I'll let you know what I think about it. All right, well, that was Cellulose, the solo variant, and as I said in that overview, I wasn't trying to really give you a really it was a high-level overview. I wasn't trying to dig deep into the rules. The multiplayer game overview will probably go a little bit more into the mechanics, but as you saw, worker placement where you are taking actions, gathering resources to, either move up tracks, convert into carbohydrates that you're placing onto the cell wall. It's all about getting points, but it is done in this overarching biological theme. So first thing I want to do is talk about some solo benchmarks. These are some big picture ideas that I like to think about when I'm considering whether to get a solo game off the shelf or not. The first thing is win-loss conditions. Is this a beat your high score variant, or are you playing against an automated opponent? And as you saw in Cellulose, you are playing against a virtual opponent named Ivy, and you can adjust Ivy's difficulty very easily just by choosing which side of her strategy mat you're going to play with. And so since this is a worker placement game where there are multiple ways to interact with an opponent, whether it's taking a spot from somebody or whether it is competing for majorities on that central vacuole board, I really think that they went the only way you really could go in this game for a solo variant, which is to have an actual opponent that is blocking spaces from you, competing with you for those majority bonuses. And it does that through this card action system. And so I am all on board with having a virtual opponent in this type of a game with this much interaction. The other thing I like to talk about is setup and teardown, and in the case of Cellulose, I feel like it is a perfectly reasonable amount of time to set up and tear down the game compared to the amount of time that you're playing it. It's going to take you a couple minutes to get it set up. It's really not much. You have that central board, you put your resources out, you put the water marker where it belongs, put out some cards. Not a big deal. And for the solo aspect of the game, it also is not terribly time consuming. You're just putting out Ivy's little board there, a couple of markers, and you're good to go. So no concerns there. I feel like it's a perfectly reasonable ratio of time to set up and tear down versus the time that you're actually playing the game. The next thing I like to talk about are rules, and overall the rules for the solo variant and for the game in general are clear. They do a good job of putting specific examples when there are times that there might be some ambiguities or edge cases, things along those lines. The solo rules are at the back of the rule book in a separate area at the back, and again, overall, they're good. There were a couple of things that I noticed that I wanted to point out that I think maybe could have been done a little bit better. The first thing is that there's a little bit of an ambiguity on what happens when Ivy takes the first player marker. And so in the rule book, it goes over what all of the action symbols means on those cards. And for that first player one, in the rule book it says, take the first action, or take the first player marker if Ivy doesn't already have it, and draw a card. On the player aid card, it just says to take the first player marker. It doesn't say anything about taking a card. Well, I've been playing it that they do take the card, A, because it says it in the rule book, and B, because on the actual space on the board, as a player, if you go there, you do draw a card off the top of the deck. And so it feels like in the spirit of the game where Ivy is simulating an opponent, they should draw a card. It would have been nice if it was on that player aid card, because it did cause me a little bit of a pause to say, okay, what do they really mean here? So I wanted to point that out. The only other thing is that it would have been nice if there was maybe a reminder on the solo helper card of how the specialization cards work, because each specific specialization card is going to move Ivy's marker on the strategy board a particular direction. And while there may be some intuition that if one is dealing towards enzymes that you would move it towards the enzymes, it would have been nice to have that laid out specifically. Relatively minor, both of those issues, but I did want to point them out. All right, the other thing I want to talk about is art and components, and this is almost overwhelmingly positive here. I feel like this has bright, vibrant art. It definitely has an educational feel, because you're kind of seeing, you know, things that might look like they belong in a biology book there on the board with the, you know, kind of the diagrams of the cells and things like that. But it doesn't look boring. It doesn't look like, when it's out on the table, it doesn't look like, oh man, what is this? This looks terrible. This looks like I'm you know, playing in the middle of a textbook. Not at all. It has enough of that vibe to bring the theme on, but not overwhelming. It doesn't look boring. It doesn't look uninviting. Bright, vibrant colors, things along those lines. I like the wooden bits. I feel like they're very nice. The carbohydrates, the water marker is very nice. The hormone markers. I like those custom wooden bits quite a bit. They're big and chunky. They're easy to move around. They're not fiddly at all. A small thing, but I really appreciated it, is that on the board, they tell you what the different resources are. So for example, those little hormone markers, the orange hormone markers, they tell you on the board, a little reminder, those are hormones. The red cubes, those are proteins. Why does that matter? Well, it matters to me because this is a game that has a unique theme, right? And that's one of the calling cards, I think. And it helps players stay immersed in the theme if they don't go, oh, give me an orange resource, give me a red resource. You know, water is easy to remember. The little blue cubes, everyone's going to remember that's water. But you're not going to necessarily remember these other things unless you have a reminder. And it's right there on the board. So, again, a small thing, but I really liked that. I really liked that I could say, oh, I'm going to go ahead and get a couple of these proteins. I'm going to go ahead and get a couple of these plant hormones, because if I didn't have that there, I probably would have just defaulted to give me an orange, give me a red, give me that type of a thing. So I liked that. The one slight negative, if I could point this out, would be that at least in the version of the game I have, which I believe is the standard retail version. There may be a deluxe edition you could have gotten through Kickstarter. You've got a multitude of different type of materials. You've got wood resources I've mentioned. You've got the acrylic cubes for the water and the CO2 and for the proteins. And then you've got cardboard resources as well. Having this kind of mixture of materials maybe doesn't feel as unified as if they were all one particular material, but again, that's a little bit nitpicky, but I figured I would mention it. Okay, so for the overall solo experience, I'm going to first mention a couple of things that maybe didn't work as well, and then talk about the things that I appreciated about the solo variant for Cellulose. First thing is that there is a relatively significant learning curve to the solo variant. And while that's not necessarily in and of itself a problem, this is probably overall a family plus or a light medium weight game. And if you're not familiar with playing solo games, especially that have a card-driven kind of an AI system, this could feel a little bit overwhelming to you. There are a number of things to consider. You know, each card is going to have multiple things that you need to evaluate, especially as the game goes on and more of Ivy's cards are going to be in play. That can be a little bit of again, a learning curve. And related to that, again, especially later in the game as you're, kind of triggering cards and having to account for them, sometimes it will take quite a bit longer on Ivy's turn than it will on your turn. Now, that's going to depend on what action you're taking. If you're just going to the get water space, that's pretty quick, or to the get protein space. If you're not triggering your own cards. So sometimes it can feel a little bit off where you're taking an action, it takes 5 seconds, you pick up your resources and you're done, and then you're going to Ivy's turn and you're kind of going through this process that can feel, a little bit lengthier. Again, that is dependent upon your action, and it's usually not a huge disparity, but it is something to mention because that is a ratio that I pay attention to when I'm playing a solo game is, am I spending more time on the AI's turn than I am on my own? Sometimes you are, sometimes you're not. On Ivy's turn, sometimes you're just simply grabbing 6 water, okay? So it's not always, but it is something to mention. All right, so for the things that I really liked about the game, this action card-based system, although I said there is a learning curve, and there is, the other side of that is that it's a very slick one. It works very, very well. And once you understand how it works, it makes sense. It makes intuitive sense, and it is something that you can kind of get into the flow of the game. Once you get it down, it feels like a really nice flow. I absolutely love the strategy board and the plant growth board. To me, that's a really brilliant way of giving Ivy a couple of specializations and focuses. That's not something that I've seen done in quite this way. I mean, there are other AI systems I've played where they're going to focus on a particular thing, but oftentimes that is predetermined at the beginning of the game. Okay, pick a particular focus for your AI. This one's going to be, depending on the type of game, this one's going to be particularly aggressive, or this one's going to go resource heavy. And you kind of know that at the beginning of the game that, this AI opponent is going to be a little bit more focused on this. In Cellulose, you don't know that. At the beginning of the game, Ivy's right in the middle of that board, and depending upon what actions they take through that card system, then they're going to specialize, and they're going to get those cards that ramp those up. Really, really neat system. I really think that is clever. It also plays very quickly for the type of game it is. It's not over before you know it by any means, but it plays quickly while still feeling satisfying. You definitely feel like you have played a full worker placement game by the end of Cellulose, but not overstaying its welcome. One of the things I will mention is that as the game goes on, specifically as you get towards the end game, there are certain actions that are likely not going to be used very much, and some people might find that to be, a little less than satisfying or problematic. But it doesn't bother me all that much. I think that actually seems to happen oftentimes in worker placement games, but I did mention that. But I like the length of play versus the experience you get. Just lastly, I really have kind of gotten on a soapbox about unique themes in games, and I really appreciate the theme of this game. Now, this publisher, Genius Games, this is what they do. They have games that have these scientific themes, and they do them in such a way that you feel like you might be learning a little bit of something, but it doesn't feel like that is coming at the expense of the game experience or of the mechanisms of the game. These are modern hobby board games that feel like modern hobby board games first, but they have this great scientific theme behind them. And they have an entire book. If you really are interested in learning more about this, there's an entire separate book that comes with this, and I've noticed this in other Genius games too, the science behind it, so that you can see the thematic connections between what you've been doing and reading the book. Now, do you need that to enjoy the game? Absolutely not, but it's there if you want it, and I appreciate that. So, all of this being said, as a overall package solo game, I think Cellulose is excellent. I'm giving an 8.5 out of 10, and this one is one that I am going to come back to. I really, really want to kind of explore the strategies and see how Ivy's different strategies are going to affect how I play out the game. And it plays quickly enough that it doesn't feel arduous to kind of get this down and set it up. I don't feel like it's going to be a huge undertaking to get this game to the table and get it played. So, Cellulose, a very, very well done solo game. If you have an interest in solo worker placement games or scientific theme games, definitely one to check out. All right, well, that's it for me. This is Mike DiLisio signing off from Dice Tower headquarters.